All right, everybody, welcome back to our study of how the story ends. We are diving into the book of Revelation again, chapter 8. Last week, if you remember, we took a look at Revelation chapter 7, taking a look at two groups of people that are going to come through the seal judgments in the early days of the book of Revelation. Two groups of people that are going to survive, that are going to be okay. In fact, they're going to be protected by God in different ways. The first group is a group of Jews, believing Jews, 144,000 Jews that are sealed with God's seal, which implies his ownership, his protection over them, and they are going to be on earth during the rest of the 70th week of Daniel, or the tribulation period, as some people call it. And they're going to apparently, we don't know from Revelation 7, but apparently going to be some kind of witnesses bearing witness and at least serving God in some way on the earth during the rest of the time of the tribulation. Then you come to the second half and you see a great multitude from every nation. And this great multitude represents, I believe, and this is what we taught last week, represents a bunch of people who have been martyred for their faith during these early days of the tribulation. So they show up in heaven. They're there. They weren't protected physically by God, but their spirits were protected. And then we have that beautiful phrase that they serve God day and night in his temple. They will hunger no more, neither thirst any more. The sun shall not strike them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb in the midst of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will guide them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Their souls, their spirits are kept safe. Their bodies, yes, sadly were martyred for their faith, but their spirits were protected by God, and now they enter into the rest and the protection and the joy of their master, and they get to see the rest of all this stuff from heaven. And it's a good thing too, because what's about to come to earth in chapters 8, 9, and following is some of the most harrowing, disturbing destruction that not only have you ever heard of, but you could even probably imagine. And so now we're going to turn our attention to chapters 8, and we'll cross over into chapter 9 today, and then we'll finish up chapter 9 next week. But there's an important thing I want to mention to you. We have some new notes that are going to be posted on the church website under the resources tab. If you click on ABF notes, you should be able to see the new ones that we have available. The title, just so you know you're working with the right one, the title is "The Trumpets Are Blown," and we'll get to why that is the case in a minute. But just want to make sure you download those before we get started. Or if you want a paper copy, even if we're not all together again, when I'm recording this, I'm not sure if we're going to be all back together again. Not all back together, but back to the way we were doing things, or if we're still going to be in the orange designation. But if you are wanting a physical copy, maybe even to pick up during the week, I will have printed a few of these and left them in the church office, and you can always stop by and pick one up if you don't have access to a printer or whatever the case may be. But either way, we're working on November the 15th, Revelation chapter 8. I want to invite you to open up your copy of the Bible to that chapter, and I'm going to read just the first 5 verses of Revelation 8. It says this: "When the Lamb opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. Then I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. And another angel came and stood at the altar with a golden censer, and he was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne. And the smoke of the incense, with the prayers of the saints, rose before God from the hand of the angel. Then the angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar and threw it on the earth, and there were peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake." Before we dive into the details of those 5 verses, I want to remind you of the same exact point I reminded you a couple of weeks back. And that's the first blank here, the first subpoint under "the trumpets are blown," important emphases in Revelation 8 through 9. The first thing I want you to remember here, and fill in these blanks, remember the heavenly vantage point for these judgments. Now, if you look back on your notes from a couple weeks back, you'll realize this is the exact same point that I put at the very beginning of that section as well. But it's so important, and I've got to go over it just remind you once more that what we are looking at here is not the way things would look if you were sitting, in your house looking out the window, watching things from an earthly perspective. This is looking at it from a slanted perspective, from heaven down to earth. Basically, John sees these events from God's perspective, not from the security camera footage of earth. So important, because we're going to see things in this passage that the people living during that time will not have any understanding of. They won't have any context to understand it. They won't be able to see it, okay? In fact, I keep telling you guys, I mentioned this to you, I think the last time we were together, it's so important for us to remember that the book of Revelation, I believe, is primarily not written for people in our generation. In fact, I think it was probably primarily written for people in that future generation that are going to be living through these events, whether it's the 144,000 Jews that are reading this, or it's going to be others who are from the great multitude who haven't been martyred yet, but people during the end times who believe in God, who have a relationship with Jesus Christ, are going to be reading the book of Revelation, and I'm telling you, it's going to make a ton more sense to them than it ever does to us. Okay? Here's something that I think is important. Let me just put it on the board here behind me. Mostly because I haven't used the board very much, and look at all this white space. I want to fill it up. So, we've talked about the heaven perspective, right? This is one point of view. This is the point of view that John is going to share with us primarily in the book of Revelation. Then we have what I call the security camera. And another way of saying security camera footage, right, is the earth perspective. Okay? The earth perspective does not have all the symbols attached. It's just the kind of the plain naked facts, just what happened, right? You see a security camera footage, it's not very interesting. Compare that to a Hollywood movie that's all edited and spliced together with music and color and sound. Like, it's two different kind of vantage points. However, if we're in a court of law, I don't want a Hollywood edited version of what happened. I don't want to watch the movie about it. I want to see what actually happened, the bare facts, okay? It's really, really, really important. If you're living in the end times, during the times this is being described, okay, you need the heavenly perspective. You need to understand what is going on from God's perspective. When things happen in your everyday life, you need to be able to, and here's the word, translate. And no, there's no place on your notes for this. Sorry. But you guys know me by now, right? Translate. What we have to do is we have to take this data right here, the heavenly perspective, right? Where it's got, the golden altar and the fire and the incense and the peals, all that stuff. We take all of the heavenly perspective stuff, and what we need to do is translate it into security camera footage type information. So like if I'm reading in the news, or let's suppose that there is news, because who knows, with all the destruction, will there be, the electrical grid, will it be up? Will we be kind of going back to prehistoric times before electricity and all that stuff? I don't know. I mean, the world's going to be pretty devastated by some of these natural disasters, let alone just all the wars and stuff taking place. But either way, let's presume that I am, listening to my radio, for example, and I hear a news broadcast that there's an army from Europe that is invading Africa or something like that, right? Now, that very well could be a description of what is going on here that John talks about from a heavenly perspective, okay? But they're not going to hear it as like, locusts, and they look like this, and they have tails, tail of fire and all that stuff. They're going to see it just as the security camera footage. And so if I'm living during that time frame, I need to be able to take the heavenly perspective, and I need to be able to translate it into my everyday life. And this is why the book of Revelation is so confusing to us. And I talked about 666 being the sign or the mark of the beast, right? 666. We have no, at least I have never found a satisfactory answer from Scripture as to why the number 666 is so significant. But the way John writes it, he writes it as if his readers would understand what it means. So either he says it to the people in the first century, and it maybe had some significance to people in the first century, which is possible, but I think is less likely, or he's writing it with the perspective that says, when the time comes and you're living through the security camera footage version of what I'm describing to you from the heavenly version, you're going to be able to get it. It's going to click in place and you're going to go, oh, 666, I get it. And in your everyday, detailed, plain facts kind of life, that number will make sense. Whereas to us today, it's kind of like, well, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And people speculate what it means. And in fact, some of the crazy people that teach on the book of Revelation, they go crazy because they try too hard to do all the translating of some of these symbolic images from the heavenly perspective, and we try to translate it into today's security camera footage from 2019 or 2020. We are in 2020, sorry. The problem is that these aren't the end times. 2020 is not the end times. It may seem like the end times with all the crazy stuff that's happened this year, but this is not the end times. So suppose it's 2050, or it's year 2482 that all this starts. When they get there, they're going to be able to make sense of all the details that we are struggling to understand, because they're going to be equipped to translate the heavenly documents and the heavenly perspective and the heavenly information. They can translate it into the year 2050 or the year 2500 or 2489 or whatever year it is. Okay? Let's focus as much of our attention as we can on understanding the big picture. Understanding things from God's perspective. That's what we're going to focus on in 2020, because we're not living in the end times. So we're going to focus on what John describes in the big picture, the heavenly perspective, and try to come up with a loose understanding of what that might look like in the security camera footage of that time. But we're never going to have 100% confidence that that's exactly the way it's going to play out, because it's not the way it works. This book was not originally written for 2020. So we have to wrestle with that, okay? Does that make sense? You with me? So really important that we get God's perspective on all of these events, all right? Next subpoint. All the trumpet judgments, because that's the next thing that's going to happen here. The next thing, we have the seventh seal is ripped open. And inside of that seventh seal are now a whole set of 7 trumpet judgments that are going to happen very quickly here in the rest of this chapter, okay? And that's the blank here. All the trumpet judgments and then the subsequent bowl judgments that begin in chapter 16, which don't worry about those, we'll get to those much later, are a result of opening the 7th seal, the 7th seal. Now, this becomes important because what you're realizing is there's a couple things going on here. By the Lamb opening the 7th seal, that means everything that happens is a part of his plan. Everything. So if you're living in the security camera footage of that time and everything feels crazy and chaotic and mayhem and destruction and Satan looks like he's winning and God looks like he's losing, the truth is, again, remember, the Lamb is the one that's bringing this plan to execution. Everything is under his purview. He knows what he's doing. He is making sure that everything goes according to plan. So if I'm living in the security camera time and I realize from the heavenly perspective, the Lamb is the one bringing this about, I can breathe a little bit easier because I know that what's going to happen is not crazy chaos. It is something that I can trust that he's going to help us with. Okay? And something that's important to realize is that somehow within the 7th seal is everything else that comes. Like all the other judgments that come from the rest of the chapters down to chapter 19, it all is a part of this 7th seal, this final piece And then inside that seventh seal, there's 7 trumpets. And then in the 7th trumpet, there's 7 bowls that end up leading to the return of Jesus Christ. So like everything is starting to happen. And I think we're now starting to get into a fairly compressed amount of time. I think the seal judgments kind of actually stretch out a little bit longer. The first 4 seals, I think, more or less cover the first 3.5 years. Plus you have all the martyrs that are complaining, when are you going to judge? And God's like, wait. Okay, his full judgment isn't coming yet. That's what's coming here in the last part. The first several years, and I think the way Daniel's prophecy breaks down, there's like a key event that happens right in the middle of that 70th set of years, of 7 years. 3.5 years in, something specific happens. It's called the abomination of desolation. Something specific happens that kind of launches what's called the Great Tribulation, this really intense time. Up until now, it's been bad. It's been really bad. It's probably been worse than anything we've experienced, and people are thinking, man, life really stinks. But then when that happens, then all of a sudden there's going to be this slide downhill. And I think all of these judgments that are happening now are happening in that second half of this time period. And they could be pretty close together based on what we're going to look at here in just a minute, okay? So that's really important. This last seal, I'm telling you what, watch out for that last seal. It's a doozy, okay? It's a big one. A lot of stuff's going to happen here in this 7th seal, starting with these judgments. Now, it's really interesting that in the verses I already read to you, verses 1 through 5, they don't just dive right into the trumpet judgments. Okay, there's not a description of what happens with them yet. There's like almost like heaven is preparing for these trumpets. In fact, it's really interesting. The very first thing that happens is nothing. That's verse 1, right? When the Lamb opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. Silence. That's the first blank there. So heaven prepares for the trumpets with silence. This is a little bit surprising, or at least I think it should be surprising to us, because there's been so much action, so much stuff happening. Even if nothing is happening on earth, in heaven, there's the angels that are praising God. There's the 24 elders that are praising God. There's the great multitude praising God. There's the 144,000 that are doing their thing on earth. There's all these things going on. Like heaven seems to be like a whirlwind of activity. And then all of a sudden, everything just stops for a half hour. Like 30 minutes is not long if you're like thinking about a TV show. But 30 minutes of silence is awkward. Some of you probably checked the sound on your computers to see if maybe I had got cut off. No, I was just being silent, which I know is rare for me. Half hour of silence right in the middle of all this action. What is that actually trying to communicate? Well, I think it's trying to communicate tension. Do you know how awkward it is, like when we're at church right during communion and you guys are waiting to see, okay, am I supposed to look? Am I supposed to pray right now? Am I supposed to look? So we're going to have the juice, or we're going to have the cup, or we're going to have the bread, and you're always kind of got one eye open. And that silence, or how about when you're in a group of people and they're praying and you didn't decide who was praying first and who was praying second and who was praying third? You're kind of just letting anybody jump in who wants to pray, and then like you prayed, and then like you're just waiting for the next person to pray, and it's so awkward and uncomfortable. And I'm telling you, that's after only like 30 seconds. Can you imagine 30 minutes of silence? I think what it's communicating is tension. There's anticipation. There's a hush that's in heaven. What is about to happen is going to be really intense. Like everything up till now has been significant, but everything from now on is going to be this intensified, wow kind of a thing. Even for heaven, and I'm sure heaven has seen some crazy stuff over human history. They're not going to see anything crazy. They haven't seen anything crazy like what they're about to see. And so there's this hush anticipation. What is going to happen? What is God going to do? It's kind of like when you're watching a scary movie. I don't know if you guys watch scary movies or not, and I watch very few of them, but like a suspenseful movie, right? There's like the scary abandoned house, and for some reason the main character goes up to the front door, and maybe he's run out of gas, and he's like, maybe I should go there, maybe I have a telephone I can call, even though like everybody has a cell phone now. But you know what I mean? Like the old school scary movies where people like broke down and had to like knock on somebody's door to use their phone. and they always go up to this door, and it's like they knock on it and it creaks open, right? And inside it's dark and there's cobwebs and you can't really see inside. And then, of course, what does the person in the scary movie always do? Of course, he goes in to the house, right? Like if that happened to me, I'd be like, no, I think I'll just go wait and hope somebody drives by. I'm not ready to go check out this scary haunted house right now. I'm just not ready for that, right? Because you know, as the listener, you're like standing watching, as they open that door and it creaks, you're not saying anything. You're sitting there silent, just waiting for this, right? Because you know something bad is about to happen. Something bad is about to happen to this character. Well, I think heaven is feeling that way too. Heaven's like, look, something really bad is about to happen to the earth. And so there's this hushed silence. Second thing, and this is really interesting, they also greet it with prayer. So there's silence. They prepare for the trumpets with silence. And then they prepare for the trumpets with prayer. And we already mentioned it, verse 3. And another angel came, stood at the altar with a golden censer, and he was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne. If you know anything about the tabernacle or the temple in the Old Testament, there were specific items or certain objects, I should say, that contained the sweet-smelling incense. And they would burn those before God, and it would go up to God, and there was this sense of, worship and all that stuff. And here, that imagery is referring to the prayers of the saints. It says here, with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne, and the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints rose before God from the hand of the angel. Okay? So what is happening here? Well, look back with me to Revelation chapter 5. We were just there a few weeks ago. Revelation 5 verse 8 says this, "And when he had taken the scroll," that's the Lamb, "the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each holding a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints." So what is this sweet smell that comes up to God? It's the prayers of his people. It's not a physical thing. Somehow, again, this is a symbolic version, right? This is the heaven perspective version. The prayers that people pray to God in heaven are like incense. They're like this pleasant smelling aroma that as you burn it, the smell goes up and it just gives you this beautiful, beautiful aroma. Okay? That's how God describes the prayers of his people. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to notice a really interesting contrast. Really interesting contrast. Go all the way back to the beginning, Genesis chapter 8. Genesis chapter 8. We have this almost exact same language about stuff like incense or smoke going up to God, coming before God, and him smelling it. And it comes all the way back to Genesis chapter 8, verse 20. Verse 20 says this, "Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took some of the clean animals and some of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar." It's very similar to what's happening in Revelation, except this is like an earth offering place, whereas that is the heavenly offering place, okay? From the heavenly vantage point, the one that's in God's presence. Look at verse 21. "And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done." So God here smells the aroma, and he decides, I'm never going to judge the way I've just judged. Now, this Noah story, right, is a time of worldwide judgment, just like the worldwide judgment that is about to happen in Revelation chapter 8. And that has been happening really since Revelation chapter 6. There's really an interesting parallel between the destruction that happened in Noah's time and the destruction that happened at the end of time. These two things are kind of like bookends. And it's really fascinating the way this aroma and smell coming up before God is the same sort of imagery used in both places. Now, here's the irony though. In Genesis, God sends the flood, right? Drowns everybody, destroys, 99.99999% of human life, saves a bunch of animals, saves only a handful of humans to start over. God is full of his righteous anger over the sins of mankind, and he's determined to judge them by sending this flood. And it almost goes too far. It like covers up the entire earth, even the tops of the mountains. And Noah's floating up on the top of the atmosphere for like several days. And then gradually God remembers his promise to Noah. He remembers his future for the people. And so he causes the waters to recede. Noah lands on the ground. He eventually gets out of the ark. And then he builds this altar. And so you have an angry God who's judged the world. He smells the aroma and he goes, okay, I'm never going to let myself get worked up like that again. I'm never going to judge humanity the way I did this time. I'm never going to send a worldwide flood to destroy the earth. So the incense of the offering actually calms God down. It reminds him of his mercy. It reminds him of his patience. It reminds him of his promises to humanity. When God can't destroy because, look, there's people there. They depend on you. They need you. The irony is when you come to Revelation chapter 8 and that exact same thing happens, this incense goes up to God and it's the prayers of his saints. But what effect does this have? What effect does this have? Look at verse 5. Then the angel took the censer that was just had the prayers of the saints in it that went up before God, and filled it with fire from the altar, right, which is on fire because it was burning up offerings, and threw it on the earth, and there were peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. And oh, by the way, then all of a sudden a bunch of angels start blowing trumpets and bad things start happening on earth. So this is the exact opposite of that. This is all of a sudden a God who is actually fairly calm, who is just sitting on his throne, not minding his own business. He's got business to do, but he's sitting on his throne. He's not particularly angry. He's not particularly whatever. And he's there, and all of a sudden this smell comes to him, and instead of him being reminded of his mercy, the immediate reaction to smelling the prayers of the saints, this pleasant aroma, this incense that goes up before God, is the opposite of Noah. It makes either God really angry, or at the very least, it shows God's righteous anger over sin, and judgment rains down on the earth. So it's the exact opposite. Now, what makes the difference? Why did the prayers of the saints here cause such a violent reaction when the incense offered in Genesis 8 actually calmed God down? It is the passage we've already looked at from Revelation chapter 6. Go back to Revelation 6, verse 9. Just across the page. When he opened the fifth seal, verse 9. When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar, the very altar we just talked about where the incense is burning and the smoke is going up before God and he's smelling it, right? Under the altar, the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness they had borne. They cried out with a loud voice, O sovereign God, holy and true, how long before you will what? Judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth. So the difference is what the saints are praying for. In Genesis 8, Noah is offering a burnt offering to remind God of his mercy, that he needs to show mercy on everybody. Here, the saints, when they pray to God, they're praying the same prayers, I believe, referred to back in chapter 6, prayers for judgment, prayers for vengeance. It's like, and you remember what happened back in chapter 6, right? They pray the prayer and they say, God, when are you going to judge? And then in verse 11 it says, they were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer until the full number of their brothers, in other words, until all the other Christians that are going to die. And then I'll bring my judgment. Okay? It's not time yet. God is already on the throne, merciful. And when we come to Revelation chapter 8, which is not, I don't think, coincidentally, right after Revelation 7, where this great multitude of martyrs show up in heaven, coming out of the Great Tribulation. But God's like, okay, I'm going to listen to the prayers of my people. It's time to punish. It's time to judge. It's time to avenge. The moment has come. Up until now, I've delayed in my mercy, in my kindness. But here we come to Revelation chapter 8, and it's like the kindness is over. The waiting is over. It's time for me to judge. It's time for me to avenge the blood of those who were killed simply because they had faith in me. Simply because of that. So in 8:5, this is coming down to a few subpoints here. It seems that the time for waiting has ended. Here's some blanks. God's judgment on those who have killed God's servants has now come. God has been moved by the prayers, that's the next blank, of his saints, to finally bring judgment. So these prayers that go up to God, the smoke that goes up to God that he smells, they provoke action. Okay? The imagery of the prayers being flung down on the earth like missiles is a powerful reminder that our prayers move God to act. Now, as the incense is burned up, right, then what the angel does is it scoops out the ashes with the burning embers in it and puts it in the censer, and then he chucks those down to the earth. I think it's an illustration of the prayers of the saints have now moved God to act, and now God is going to bring judgment upon people. And I think this tells us something about prayer. It's a bit of a roundabout way to get there, but I think this is significant. Prayer is not just asking God, how do I say this? I don't want you to misunderstand me. And we talked about this, I think, a couple weeks ago, or maybe even last week. Prayers are not always supposed to be nice and neat and tidy. There are times when you feel angry because you've been hurt and abused and taken advantage of by somebody. Maybe because you're a Christian, maybe not, maybe some other reason. But when you cry out to God after you've been sinned against, and you want justice, you want vengeance, that's not a bad thing to want. It's not a sinful thing to want. God is a God of justice. God is a God who will give vengeance in the proper way in the proper time. And so these prayers that they pray to God are not polite prayers. God, how long before you blow everybody up for what they've done? How long before you hold them accountable for their actions? How much longer are you going to be merciful? And I think what it shows is that there's room in our prayer times for more than just the nice, neat, antiseptic prayers. There's also time when your heart is broken, you feel blistered in your heart because you're so angry over the wrongs that have been done to you, that it's okay to ask God to judge. It's okay to ask God to take his place as the judge. Now, should that be tempered with a realization that we need God to be merciful as well, not just to us, but also merciful to our enemies? Of course, of course. I'm not saying that praying for mercy is somehow inferior to praying for justice. But I do think there's a place for praying for both. And our prayers do move God to act. Now, certainly, he acts in his own ways, and he does it according to his own timing. In other words, he doesn't come to me and say, Toby, what time do you want me to answer your prayer? But my prayers matter. My prayers move God to act. My prayers are important. Your prayers are important. Whether you're praying for mercy and salvation and forgiveness for someone, or you're praying for the appropriate amount of justice to be shown if people refuse to repent, your prayers matter, and your prayers move God. Now, certainly, I don't think we talk God out of stuff he was never planning to do, and he probably would have done all these things even without the prayers of his people, but the text is written in such a way so that we realize the action that propelled God to throw his judgment down on the earth at this point were the prayers of his people. Because, and this is the final blank under that first section, our prayers matter. And just because we don't see an answer right now does not mean that our prayers don't matter. That's why Jesus told us to be persistent in our prayers, to keep praying, to not give up on God. Because God, he has his own timetables, but he does act. He is moved by our cries. Okay? So let me hit now the first four judgments. These first four trumpets. Now it's really interesting. We're going to read them in just a minute. But the first four trumpet judgments are lumped together. In the way that they're described in the text, you have the first angel, second angel, third angel, fourth angel, first trumpet, second trumpet, third trumpet, fourth trumpet, and then there's like a summary statement at the end of it, which is really interesting because that's almost exactly like what happened in the seal judgments, if you remember, right? Seal number 1, 2, 3, and 4, we have the white horse, then we have the black horse, then we have the red horse, then we have the pale horse. And the four horsemen of the apocalypse, if you want to call it that, it's kind of a sensationalized title, but whatever. That's how people come to know it. Those four horsemen are kind of lumped together, and then you have seal 5 and 6 and 7 that are kind of pulled apart from the first four. Well, that's the way these trumpets work as well. The first four trumpets seem to be linked together, lumped together, and then trumpet 5, trumpet 6, and then trumpet 7 are going to be handled separately. Okay, so before we read, I just wanted you to have that in the back of your heads. And you'll notice that as we read along. So verses 6, I'm going to read down through verse 13. Now the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared to blow them. Now the first angel blew his trumpet, and there followed hail and fire mixed with blood, and these were thrown upon the earth. And a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. The second angel blew his trumpet, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood. A third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. The third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many people died from the water because it had been made bitter. The fourth angel blew his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of their light might be darkened, and a third of the day might be kept from shining, and likewise a third of the night. Verse 13, Then I looked, and I heard an eagle crying with a loud voice as it flew directly overhead, Woe, woe, woe to those who dwell on the earth, at the blast of the other trumpets that the 3 angels are about to blow. So you can see there, verse 13 clearly kind of sets 1 through 4 off from 5, 6, and 7. And the way it does it, it's really interesting. It makes it seem like, you know all the problems you just went through in trumpet 1, 2, 3, 4? Trumpet 5, 6, and 7 is going to be way worse. Like you ain't seen nothing yet. But let's get back to trumpets 1, 2, 3, and 4. What do we see there? Basically, here's a summary statement. All these judgments involve what I'm calling heavenly bodies. Heavenly bodies, right? There's this mixture of hail and fire. And where does it fall? It falls somewhere on the earth, right? And it burns up a lot of the green space, all the grass, a third of the trees, a third of the plants. A third of the earth was burned up, a third of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. So that's significant. Then it says something like a great mountain that was on fire falls into the sea. Then it says a great star falls on the earth and ends up polluting the fresh water. And then you have the sun, moon, and stars, which we would recognize as being partially darkened. About a third of them are darkened. So there's just a lot more darkness in the world than there was before. Now, you got to remember, when we're trying to piece this together, right? He's describing it from the heavenly perspective. But I sometimes get curious about the security camera footage. Like, what would it look like to somebody, eating lunch on this fateful day down on earth? They're out, they're out with their family, they're eating outdoors at a cafe, and then all of a sudden, all of this stuff starts to go down. Like, what would it actually look like? What maybe might be some kind of a scientific explanation for it? Now, you got to understand, John doesn't care about that. John doesn't care about giving us a scientific explanation about what the actual security camera footage on Earth is going to look like. He's showing it to us from God's perspective. And he's using descriptive words to show he doesn't really know what he's seeing either, right? He says something like a big mountain that's on fire, okay? So it looks like a rock, a giant rock that's on fire, and it hits the seas. He talks about a star falling from heaven. Now, we know how that works. To say that a star falls is to imply that you're describing it from the Earth's perspective. A star falling is not really falling. It's just we see it streaking across the sky, right? Or entering into our atmosphere, say, for example. But John is not interested in describing it scientifically. He's trying to give us the heavenly perspective. So it's very possible that these judgments are some sort of asteroids or meteors that are hitting the earth all at once. And it's possible that these are, obviously, if a big enough asteroid hits our earth, or a meteor shower, you've heard of that, meteor showers. And normally it's just like little streaks of light, right? Because rock hits the outer atmosphere and it burns up on the way in and it looks pretty, but it doesn't really damage life. If something is going to clear that protection and actually hit the earth, which some places have done, in fact, there's a really crazy video of a meteor hitting Russia somewhere, and somebody caught it on a security camera footage. It's crazy. You see this thing streaking in. It looks like something out of a sci-fi movie, and then crashing into the earth. It's nuts. Look it up. Russian meteor. Try looking that up on YouTube, and I bet you'll find that video somewhere. It's crazy. Can you imagine an asteroid the size of a mountain hitting the Earth and crashing into the ocean? It would probably look, as it fell, like a mountain, a giant piece of rock that is on fire. Why would it look like it's on fire? Because as it comes through the atmosphere, it's burning through the atmosphere. And a meteor also has some ice and stuff from being out in space, and that ice melts, and as it melts, that's what you tend to get kind of the look that, asteroids, when you look up in the sky and you see like a meteor, that's what it looks like, a comet, something like that. So it's possible that what is happening here in these first four judgments are some kind of an asteroid, asteroids hitting the Earth, or a meteor shower that is actually penetrating our atmosphere and then crash landing on Earth. And the effect of this is devastating, right? It's devastating parts of the Earth. A third of the Earth is now burned up, completely on fire. You want to talk about wildfires? These meteor crashes or asteroids or whatever it is that hits the Earth is going to spark wildfires, and it's going to burn, rage out of control. All the green grass on the Earth is going to be gone. Okay? And I think, too, another thing to keep in mind, it's very possible that these four judgments all happen right around the same time. In fact, it could be describing the same judgment from four different perspectives, or four different elements of the same judgment. Just like I think the first four seals describe general conditions on Earth at the same time, right? You have a conqueror, you have famine, you have war, and you have death. Like, those four things are all happening at the same time, more or less. And I think that's very likely an explanation for the seals. And I think it's also very likely that these four trumpet judgments are happening all at the same time. Why? Because they're describing the same sort of thing, right? Stuff in heaven, outside the atmosphere, is falling to the Earth and causing all this damage. In fact, these four trumpets are very much interconnected and interrelated. Now, another subpoint here I want you to write down. These all seem to be connected to the fiery missile prayers from 8:5. So that's what goes in the blanks there, fiery missile. So it seems like, it's almost like when they throw those prayers, I should say the ashes from the prayers, throw the ashes from the prayers down on Earth, that's what it looks like from the heavenly perspective. And maybe from the security camera perspective, as you look up, you see a bunch of asteroids coming at the Earth, breaking through, and then just wreaking havoc and damaging and destroying different parts of the Earth. And I think it's connected to the prayers that God's people had prayed that said, God, it's time for judgment. And God's like, okay, here we go, judgment. Let me show you some judgment. Whoom. He starts chucking fastballs at the Earth. And these asteroids or other things, comets, whatever, meteors, are going to actually penetrate the Earth and not bounce off the atmosphere and go off, but they're going to penetrate the atmosphere and come crash and cause damage and destruction on the Earth. Now, the main effect of these judgments, right, the next subpoint here, is to consume a large percentage of the Earth's resources. That seems to be the dominant figure. We don't hear, for example, about body counts. We don't hear about a third of the Earth died, or 1/4 the population died, or 1/10 of this population, or 100,000. We don't find out about how many people die. What we find out about is how many resources have been lost, right? A third of the trees get burned up. A third of the Earth gets burned up. All the green grass is gone. Then we find out that he lands, the one that looks like a giant mountain, it falls into the sea. And the sea becomes blood. Now, I'll be honest with you. I don't know if this is a reference back to Moses, where the Nile turned to blood, or if it's just a way of saying that it's going to pollute a third of the Earth's oceans with some kind of a red, filmy substance that looked like blood. I don't know if it's actual blood or if it just looked like blood, but what we know is that when that asteroid or whatever hits the Earth, when that giant mountain that's on fire hits the sea, it's going to pollute and contaminate a third of the oceans. Now, I want you to think about that. A third of the world's oceans in one day are now contaminated. You can't use it for anything. You can't desalinate it. There's a lot of animals that are swimming around in there. We depend upon those animals for food, especially people that live in coastal areas, right? And all of a sudden it says a third of all, let me see here. Let me go back. Verse 9, a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. So I suspect that when he talks about a third, it's talking about like one of the oceans, like the Atlantic Ocean is just contaminated. And all of the ships that were in the Atlantic Ocean, destroyed. All of the animals, all of the sea creatures that live in the Atlantic Ocean, dead. They start floating to the surface because they could not survive this experience. That's pretty devastating. But can you imagine, think about this, what's going to happen to the people that survive this? Sure, I'm sure there's going to be people that die in all of the upheaval and the crashing and everything that's going to happen. Not to mention the tsunami waves that happen when something large hits an ocean and it sends water shooting out towards the coast area. So people are going to die. But for the people that survive, the horrifying part of this is when there's just less and less to feed people, there's less and less to provide for people. The world's economies are being just destroyed. You think COVID's been bad for the world economy? Wait till this stuff happens and you see that people are all of a sudden now fighting over the scraps. And what tends to happen when there's a shortage, right? We're running out of toilet paper. What happens? Everybody runs to the store at the same time and grabs their 45 rolls of toilet paper to make it through the pandemic. Who cares about everybody else? Who cares if everybody else has enough toilet paper? No, I can't take a few less rolls for myself to make sure other people have some. I've got to grab them all for myself. Well, that's what's going to happen. The survivors are going to hoard resources. Strong people are going to be able to abuse the poor and abuse the weak. And there's going to be people dependent on other people for supplies. And the rule of law is not going to hold. There'll be some nations that still inspire fear. And I'm sure there'll be some people that obey certain leaders because of fear. But as far as like what we think of today of a civilized society where everybody sort of follows these social rules, those are going to be gone. There's going to be chaos. There's going to be people that die, not just in the initial crash, but also going to be in the afterwards when people run out of food. All of a sudden, people who live in coastal areas, they can't go fishing. All of their supplies, they don't have anybody to lean on. All of a sudden, the cost of goods are going to go way up. It's going to be crazy. And we always, as humans, degenerate into the worst version of ourselves when we run out of resources. When we have to fight with other people for basic resources, we turn into really scary, ugly, greedy, grabby people. And I have a feeling that's what the tenor of life is going to be like on the earth at this time. Now, what's really interesting to report in this, and this is the next section here, is that there's no effect of this recorded. No effect. That's what goes in that blank. There's no report of the effect of these traumatic events, followed by an ominous warning about the final 3 trumpets, as if these first 4 were actually no big deal. Like, it's almost like when that eagle goes and starts flying around and saying, oh, woe, woe, woe to those who dwell on the earth because of the 3 that are still to come. It's almost like they're saying, hey, the easy part is over, right? 1/3 of the world's resources have been depleted in one day, probably, maybe in 1 hour. Maybe in one, maybe not. Maybe in a few months. I don't know if they're going to happen all together or if they're going to happen one after the other. But in a short amount of time, huge resources of the world have been depleted, and I'm sure a lot of people have died, and chaos is reigning on a major part of the earth. And the eagle goes, don't worry, guys, the easy part is over now. The hard part is still to come. And if you're paying attention, if you're really listening to this, you kind of go, how can it get worse than this, right? Like, 2020 is going to look like a picnic. It's going to look like a trip to Disney World, right? Compared to what these people are going to be living through, okay? Now, something that's also important to remember. The book of Revelation is hard to read. And it should drag our emotions down a little bit when we see God judging people like this, right? We shouldn't be joyful or gleeful that the wicked are finally getting what's coming to them, right? Like I know we feel that way, and there's a sense in which God's justice is honored when he judges people for their sin. But there shouldn't be any glee on our part as we listen to this. Like, if you feel disgusted when you kind of really think this through, and if you feel kind of like your stomach turning inside of you, then you're probably where you need to be. Because this is going to be horrific. This is going to be horrible. This is going to be awful. And I think, friends, this is why the Bible puts such a big emphasis on warnings. Warnings, right? And we conservative Christians who take the Bible seriously, we come across as being people that are always raining on everybody's parade, right? Because no matter how good things get and how great the economy is for a minute, or how wonderful this person is, or how great this nation is doing, we're always the one that say, this isn't going to last. The good times are not here to stay. You're not going to build a utopia on earth. I'm sorry, it's just not going to happen. Don't worry. And we're also going to say, your actions, when you turn away from God, have consequences, and you're going to face the consequences of those actions. Like, nobody really gets thrilled hearing about the warnings, for example, about hell. Nobody likes to hear that. I don't like talking about it. I don't like thinking about it. To this moment, I don't think about hell very much on purpose because I just can't take it. My stomach turns over thinking about the suffering of people in that place. And the fact that it seems from Scripture to be inescapable. That's a problem for me. I have trouble with that. And I think the world doesn't like it either. But the Bible doesn't apologize for being filled with warnings, right? Doom and gloom. You know, brimstone, fire and brimstone. Why are you preachers always talking about hell? Why are you always talking about judgment? Because God is desperately trying in His grace to get a few things across to us while we have time for it to come across to us. If you get to this point in human history and there's an asteroid bearing down on you that's about to destroy the resources of the earth and possibly end your life, wouldn't it have been nice to have 10 minutes where you had thought about what led to that point and maybe you could have avoided that judgment? Now, this is just a side note, and this isn't like a central part of this text, but it's something that popped into my head because we need to wrestle with this. Warnings are our best friend. God is being honest with us about the future. He's being honest with us about the consequences of our action because He desperately wants us to do the right thing. If God really wanted to judge us more than anything else, if He just got His thrills out of burning humans who are bad, He wouldn't warn us. He wouldn't disrupt our happy little lives. He would just let us merrily skip our way right up to the edge of the cliff and then merrily take our jump off the cliff. He would let us do that. He wouldn't put a sign up that says, "Watch out for the cliff." He wouldn't send somebody to try to stop runners from going over the cliff and saying, "Hey, if you keep running, you're going to plunge to your death and die." But He does, and the Bible's filled with warnings because God doesn't want anybody to get to this place. He wants everybody to turn around. He wants everybody to hear and to repent. And so He gives all of us, even the people He knows will ignore His warnings, He gives us all His warnings because He loves us and He wants to save as many of us as possible. So keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. The Bible talks a lot about bad stuff, uncomfortable stuff, painful stuff, judgment type stuff. But it does it not because God gets thrilled about it and gets excited, can't wait to start blowing people up. It's because God is trying to warn as many of us as possible so we don't get to that place. And that's just a clear Old Testament and New Testament teaching. The use and the role of warnings in all this stuff. But anyway, all right, now let's move into chapter 9. And I'm just going to catch the first few verses of chapter 9. And we're going to talk about one more trumpet, trumpet number 5. And this trumpet is also called the first woe, right? Because the eagle says, "Woe, woe, woe," to the people who dwell on earth because of the 3 trumpets that are about to blast. And so that's kind of John's way of setting up, okay, each trumpet that's to come, there's 3 trumpets, 3 woes. So each trumpet is its own woe. And then you'll notice at the very end, if you look at verse 12, it says, "The first woe is past. Behold, 2 woes are still to come." John is making sure you understand, okay, 5th trumpet is the first woe. 6th trumpet, second woe. 7th trumpet, third woe. And he's going to lay that out in the rest of the story here. Okay? So this is the one that gets really weird. All right? Up till now, these are all like natural type phenomenon. You can at least picture it in your mind, right? Everything that's happened so far is like, wow, that's like a really extreme version of things that already happen. When you come to this one here, this is just weird. It's just weird, okay? Let's read the first paragraph, verses 1 through 6. "And the 5th angel blew his trumpet, and I saw a star fallen from heaven to earth, and he was given." So hold on just a second here. If this is really talking about a star, like a ball of gas falling to the earth, and it's not a symbolic way to describe, say, an angel, then you wouldn't expect that the star would be called a he. he was given, right? You would say it was it was given, this thing, or a star can't do anything. If it hits the earth, it's just gonna, I don't know, it's done. This star that falls and hits the earth, I think, is an angel. Okay, it's some kind of angelic being, and they're using the term star symbolically from the heavenly perspective to tell you something about it. I don't know if that means that it's like really shiny, because a lot of the angels, when they appear to us on earth, are bright and shining. Like you remember at the Christmas story, when the angels show up, there's a bright light, and the glory of the Lord shone round about them, and the shepherds were sore afraid, according to the King James, right? Angels tend to be glowy when they come to earth. Not always, but sometimes they do. They let the glory of God glow off of them. Well, here's an angelic figure that has a similarity to a physical star, and that I think he's bright, shiny, glowy. And he descends from heaven to earth. And notice what's happened here. He was given the key to the shaft of the bottomless pit. Okay, this is already getting really weird. Bottomless pit. We've not heard of this place before. And in fact, I think this is the first reference to the bottomless pit anywhere in the Bible. And there's only a couple other references after this. But let's be prepared for the fact that this is kind of weird. First of all, it's a bottomless pit. So already we're outside the realm of what you would normally expect, right? When Joseph was thrown into a pit to wait until they could sell him for money, his brothers, it was a pit, had a bottom. Joseph sat on the bottom and waited for them, and then they pulled him out and sold him off to traders. This is a bottomless pit, so there's something spiritual going on here. Okay, this is not just a normal, straightforward thing. I think these are signals to the reader, hey, you're entering into some symbolic land here. So you need to kind of read this with an eye towards interpreting a symbol or two along the way. All right, so we're going to try to read it that way. Verse 2, he opened the shaft of the bottomless pit. Great, because everything great happens when you open up Pandora's box, right? You open the lid, that's when everything great happens. And from the shaft rose smoke, like the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened with the smoke from the shaft. So all of a sudden, picture you open up this shaft, and then smoke just goes straight up to heaven. Verse 3, then from the smoke came locusts on the earth, and they were given power like the power of scorpions of the earth. They were told not to harm the grass of the earth, or any green plant, or any tree, but only those people who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. They were allowed to torment them for 5 months, but not to kill them, and their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it stings someone. And in those days, people will seek death and will not find it. They will long to die, but death will flee from them. Now that's a pretty intense, that's a woe, right? That is a really big problem. So just in summary, here's the first subpoint here. The first woe is a cloud of locusts that will torment the world for a given period of time, okay? A cloud of locusts. Now, the interesting question, this is the next subpoint, the interesting question is this. Are these literal locusts, like, insects that we can find in the world today? Or are they intended to be understood as symbolically referring to something else? Let me just give you my answer, because I've sort of already poisoned the well with my early descriptions. I believe that these locusts are not intended to be understood as literal fill-in-the-blank insects. You've heard about the murder hornets out in the West Coast, right? They found a big nest of them, I guess, nesting somewhere out in Washington State or something like that. Great. That's all 2020 needs are murder hornets. Apparently their sting, I saw a video of a guy who allowed one of them to sting him just to see kind of how it compares to other pain. Like, this is a strange guy, but he literally did. He let it sting him, and he was in absolute agony. This murder hornet was a big deal. But here's the thing. I don't believe that what he's describing here in Revelation chapter 9 are like giant murder hornets that come up from the ground somewhere and then like fan out across the earth. Okay, I don't see it that way. I think they're meant to be understood as a demonic army that is unleashed on the earth. Okay, so there's a couple different options here. One is it could be these are real insects. and these insects torment people for 5 months. Well, that's believable because insects torment people now, right? You could be these murder hornets, these locusts, right? And then you also have the possibility, because of where it comes from, this strange supernatural bottomless pit. Hornets come from somewhere. Locusts come from somewhere physical. This is coming from someplace spiritual. So another option is it could be some kind of a demonic army or an army of demons that is unleashed upon the earth. And I think it's the second of the two. I think it's a demonic army, not literal insects. But let me try to give you my reasoning for it. How did I come to that conclusion? Let me try to break it down. First of all, open up with me and go all the way back to Joel. Joel. I don't know why I blanked out there. Joel chapter 2. I know it's in that part of the Bible we don't read very much. Joel is right before Amos, and it's right after Hosea in the minor prophets. Joel chapter 2, and if you need to pause to look it up, like where it is, and get a minute, pause me. It's totally fine. Ready? Okay, go. Joel 2, verse 25 says this: I will restore to you the years that the swarming locust has eaten, the hopper, the destroyer, and the cutter. And then he says this: my great army which I sent among you. Okay? God is making a promise here at the end of Joel chapter 2. He's saying, look, someday in the future, I'm going to give you back the years that the locusts took away from you. All the things that they ate from you. The hopping locust, the destroying locust, the cutter. My great army. He uses that phrase to describe this group of locusts. If you go back to the beginning of Joel chapter 2, you have this really fascinating description. Verse 3. Or no, verse 2. Verse 1. Blow a trumpet in Zion. Sound an alarm on my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. It is near, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness. Like blackness there is spread upon the mountains a great and powerful what? People. Their like has never been before, nor will be again after them through the years of all generations. Fire devours before them, and behind them a flame burns. The land is like the Garden of Eden before them, but behind them a desolate wilderness, and nothing escapes them. So, what is this group of locusts that has devoured the years of the Israelites? It's an invading army from another country. It's a great and numerous people that swoop down on the land and cut and destroy and burn everything behind them, just like a literal group of locusts will settle onto a field and eat all the food and leave it desolate before they move on. He's describing an invasion of a physical army from another nation. And then he calls it in verse 25, just to make sure you don't understand, a great army. So in the Bible, and also, by the way, and I put some other references there for you to look up, Judges 6 and 7, Jeremiah 46 and 51, God refers to human armies as locusts. He's describing it using that imagery, okay? So it's a common Old Testament image to compare an invading army to locusts. That's a common thing in the Old Testament, all right? So that's what goes in that blank there. Comparing invading armies, blank, to locusts is a common OT image. And I want to point out to you, this is the only reference to locusts in the New Testament, okay? Now, why is that an important point? Because suppose in the New Testament, they're like, you know what? I know in the Old Testament, locusts were often used to describe an invading army. Here in the New Testament, we're going to use that image differently, and we're going to only refer to them as, the actual insects or something like that. But that doesn't happen in the New Testament. The only other example of locusts even being referred to is twice, once in Matthew, once in Mark, where it mentions that John the Baptist eats locusts, the real actual insects, for his food. And then here we have these locusts that come up out of the everlasting bottomless pit and start tormenting people. So in my mind, this is God picking up an Old Testament image, which he does all through the book of Revelation, going back to the Old Testament saying, hey, do you remember that swarm of locusts that invaded your country back in Joel 2? And that then God said, I will restore you, like all the things that they've taken away from you, my great army. You remember that army of people that I described as locusts? Here's these locusts that are coming up out of the ground, okay? And I think it's describing an army. Now, why do I say that? Take a look at verse 7 of Revelation 9. Revelation 9:7 says, "In appearance, the locusts were like horses prepared for battle." So there's the army image. "On their heads they wore what looked like crowns of gold. Their faces were like human faces, their hair like women's hair, and their teeth like lions' teeth. They had breastplates like breastplates of iron, and the noise of their wings was like the noise of many chariots with horses rushing into battle. They have tails and stings like scorpions, and their power to hurt people for 5 months is in their tails. They have as king over them the angel of the bottomless pit. His name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek he's called Apollyon." So here's the next subpoint here, where it says 9:7 through 11, describes the locusts as an army prepared for war with a king over them. So again, I don't think he's talking about literal insects. I think he's using that as an Old Testament image to talk about some kind of an invading army that's going to invade the earth from this bottomless pit. They even have a king over them, and they have weapons, and they have armor. Like, all this stuff is army type imagery. So it seems clear, this is the next subpoint, it seems clear to me at least that God is describing these locusts using common Old Testament imagery to describe some kind of an invading force. That's the next two blanks. Invading force. And I'm going to put this in parentheses. Of some kind. We don't know what kind of invading force. We don't know from where. We don't know who's in it yet. But they're set on destruction. Destruction. So the next question is, what kind of an army is it? Is it an army of visible humans empowered by invisible demons? Or is it just an army of invisible demons, right? Because those are a couple of options. One option is that this invading army is an army of people, people like you and me, that look like you and me, but they're empowered by demons who kind of lead them to do all these horrifying things. That's one option. We know of people in Jesus' day that were possessed by demons and were largely just bodies that demons would take over, and then they would control these bodies through whatever means that they're allowed to. So it's possible that that's the kind of army we're describing here. Or it's possible that John is describing to us an invisible army that's going to be tormenting people invisibly, kind of like how demons torment us today. You know, Satan tempts us to sin. Demons tempt us to turn away from God, tempt us to break God's laws all the time. But I don't ever see demons when they tempt me to do bad things. They're invisible, but they can still influence my life. And I think it's possible, in fact, I think it's very probable that this is actually an invisible army. So when they burst up out of the bottomless pit, heaven could look down and see them coming up out of this bottomless pit. But if you were sitting in your living room on the security camera footage on earth, you wouldn't have seen anything, because these demons are not literal things you could see with your eyes. They're spiritual beings that have certain capabilities and abilities to torment. They're going to be now let loose in the earth. Now, why do I believe that it's an army of invisible demons instead of some kind of an army of visible humans empowered by demons? Well, three things. This army, this is the first subpoint here, this army does not come from a physical place somewhere on earth, but a spiritual one somewhere in the spiritual realm, the bottomless pit. So the fact that the bottomless pit is a spiritual place leads me to think that whatever is being kept there is also a spirit being of some kind. When you go to Revelation chapter 20, and don't do it yet, you've got to wait for me, I'm not going to get there for a while yet. In Revelation chapter 20, when Satan is captured at the end of the 70th week of Daniel, he's not going to be thrown into the lake of fire right away. In fact, he's going to be bound with some kind of a chain, and he's going to be thrown into the bottomless pit to wait there for 1,000 years. So it seems like this bottomless pit is some kind of a holding cell or some kind of a prison, and I think it's a prison for spirit beings. It's not a prison for human beings or living physical beings. Okay, does that make sense? So that's one of the reasons why I think this is a demonic, invisible army. The second thing is they don't look like humans, right? They look like some kind of a demonic force or some kind of demonic army. Now, we're not going to go back, but if you take a look at the description where it says here, On their heads they had like what were like crowns of gold. Their faces were like human faces. Their hair like women's hair. Their teeth like lions' teeth. Breastplates like breastplates of iron. And the noise of their wings was like the noise of many chariots with horses rushing into battle. They have tails with stings like scorpions. And like you get this really odd description, right? Like no human has ever looked like that. Now you may have saw somebody and you're like, whoa, yeesh. But generally speaking, humans don't have tails. Generally speaking, humans don't have teeth like lions. I mean, maybe you might want to sharpen your canines a little bit for that, but not so much. I mean, obviously, they have human faces. They have hair like women. They have long, streaming hair, I guess, is what they're trying to get at there. But it doesn't necessarily mean, right, that this is not what humans look like. Whereas if you compare earlier in Revelation chapter 4, the 4 living creatures, right? They have all kinds of weird amalgamations of different things. They have like wings, and then one of them looks like an ox, and one has the face of a man. And then you go back to Ezekiel 1 and Isaiah 6, and these angelic figures, these seraphim and cherubim, which is the Hebrew words for the kinds of angels there in Isaiah 6 and Ezekiel 1. These angels are seeming like some kind of a mashup of like various characteristics of other creatures that kind of get smushed together, and they have this new thing called a seraphim, this new thing called a cherubim, some kind of angelic being that just looks weird and looks different. Now, is it possible that God is describing humans, just ascribing to them kind of symbolic descriptions to kind of give you a sense of how fierce they are? Well, of course, that's possible. But I think it's a little bit unlikely. Okay? Because when you compare it to the description of the 4 living creatures, it just seems like we're talking about something in that same realm, which I think is some kind of demonic, angelic spirit being that has a look that's different from what humans would look like. And then the third thing is this. Their king is very clearly called an angel, and then the angel is given 2 names. One is Abaddon in Hebrew, and the other one is Apollyon in Greek. All right, it's most likely Satan himself or some other high-ranking angel. He's called the angel of the bottomless pit in the text. So their leader is an angel. He's in the same bottomless pit they were in. It leads me to believe that perhaps what is being described here is an invisible army of demons that are loosed into the world in order to torment people for a certain amount of time. So that's my line of reasoning. So I don't think you would wake up one day and you would look and you would see this scary locust thing with eyes like a face like a human and hair like women's hair and teeth like lions and a scorpion tail. Like I don't think you would look up and go, oh, the scary locust is coming. I don't think you would do that. I think you would just be sitting in your chair and a demon who may look like that comes to you and starts to torment you in some physical or emotional or spiritual way. And use that tail to use that ability to be able to somehow cause you physical or emotional or spiritual pain and put you in torment for day after day after day after day. I believe there's demons that are doing things like this in our world right now, actively tormenting people. I don't know this for a fact, but I think some of the illustrations of extreme mental illness may perhaps not just be a physical thing that's happening. It could be some kind of a demonic tormenting that's going on. And people are experiencing that torment, even though physically they don't see anybody walking up to them to do anything to them. But in the spiritual realm, they're being tormented in their spirit. And I think that is very likely what is happening here. Now, ultimately, and this is my final point, and then I'll be done. So for those of you that are like, oh, how much longer? We're almost done. Ultimately, whether it's a human army or if it's a demonic army that's invisible, it doesn't really matter. It could even be like weird-looking insects that cause the tormenting. It doesn't really matter which one of the 3 options it is, okay? Because there's a few things that we absolutely know for sure, whether it's an insect or it's a human controlled by demons or it's an invisible demon itself. Number 1, they serve evil forces, right? Their king is Abaddon, Apollyon, which means destroyer in both languages. So they are not on God's side. They are evil. They serve evil. They are evil beings that are trying to do destruction, all right? But here's the second thing. This is really important to know. They have been unleashed by divine permission, that's the first blank, as a divine punishment. So divine permission as a divine punishment. God is the one that gives the key to this star, this angel, I believe, that unlocks and lets them all out of prison. God is the one that opens up the door. Now, does God tell them what to do? Does God give them their marching orders? No, Apollyon does that. Abaddon does that. But God unlocks the door. He gives his permission. Do what you're going to do, because he has said that now is time to torment and judge people who have sinned against me. So God gives divine permission so that these beings can go out and torment humanity as a divine punishment for their sin. Now, another thing we know for sure, whether it's hornets, murder hornets, scary insects, or it's humans, or it's invisible demons, their power is to torment, not to kill. To torment, not to kill. In fact, people are going to want to die and not be able to. Somehow this torment is going to, and that's why I think it's likely and it's possible, this is not physical torment we're talking about. This could be emotional torment. This could be spiritual torment, where you feel like your insides are just ripped up inside of you. Maybe you have nightmares and horrifying visions of things like people talk about with extreme mental illness or something like that. And it's very possible that they're so, they want to die, but they're not able to. They're somehow not able to take their own lives. In fact, it says here, people will long to die, but death will flee from them. The way I put that in the notes is, in fact, death would be a mercy. The torment is ongoing. But here's the good news. The scope of their torment is limited. The scope of their torment is limited. They only have 5 months to do this. They only have 5 months to do this. And it's such an odd thing, 5 months. Which 5 months? I don't know. It doesn't say. At what point in the 7 years? I don't know. Is it 5 consecutive months? Is it like a month here and then a month off and another month? I don't know any of that either. The Bible doesn't really talk about it. But the key thing is that God has a limit put in place. These are not beings that are just running wild and now they get to call the shots. Even as they run wild and do destruction on their own bidding, because their own desires are to destroy, God is not prompting them to destroy. God still has boundaries set for them. And the boundary is 5 months. That's it. And in 5 months, you're done. You're done. And God in his power is going to retract this army or destroy this army or get rid of this army of beings, whether they're insects or humans or demons or a combination of all three. He's going to get rid of them so they no longer can torment past 5 months. This is something that's so important, is that God has these things. Even his judgment is measured. God does not fly off the handle. God does not go too far. God knows exactly how far his judgment ought to go, and he takes it right up to the end of that judgment, and then he stops, because he's in control of himself and his own emotions, and he's also in control of the universe. And he knows what each action deserves. He's going to take it right up to that point, and then it's going to stop. God is in control. Satan, even when Satan is running wild on the earth, Satan is not independent of God's finger and God's control. God still calls the shots. And then the last limit of their scope, and this is really interesting. Did you notice who they're targeting? They only target, look at verse 4. They were told not to harm the grass of the earth or any green plant or any tree, but only those people who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. Well, the only people we know of that have the seal of God are those 144,000 Jews that are roaming around the earth serving God in some way during this time. So they're going to be exempt. Whatever these beings are, whether they're insects or humans or demons, they're going to come right at those 144,000 and go around them. They don't have permission to touch those people. Why? Because again, God is in control, and this is a judgment on unbelievers. They only target unbelieving humans. They can't do whatever they want. Satan can't do whatever he wants. It seems like he can do whatever he wants because horrible things happen all the time. But even the horrible things that God allows, he says, look, there's a limit to what I will allow. I'm not going to allow you to go too far. So that's the first woe. 4 trumpets, I think, all happening close together or at the same time that damage the world's resources. And it's like, oh my word, right? And people are now scrambling to try to figure out how they're going to survive. And then, I believe, A demonic army is unleashed on the earth to torment the survivors for 5 months. They're going to want to die, and they're not going to be able to They won't be able to find death. It's going to be a horrific, awful, awful time on our earth. Next week, we're going to take a look at the second woe, which is actually the sixth trumpet, and it gets a little bit worse. And what we're going to find out is the response of the people to all of this judgment. How does it change people's hearts? Does it at all? We'll look at that next week. Thank you for your patience. I know this one ran over a little bit, but I hope it's helpful to kind of get through a challenging portion of Scripture. I hope it helps you understand it a little bit better. And hey, if you have to watch it in 2 or 3 bites because, you know what, one time is too long to sit through, that's fine with me. Either way, we'll be back next week taking a look at the second half of Revelation chapter 9. Lord bless you guys. You're dismissed.